Hello, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight to look at the third International. We've looked at the first and the second one. Both times Roger Silverman's given excellent introductions for further discussion from the floor, etc. The third International obviously is hugely important. It's a hugely important period politically after the Russian Revolution, founded in 1919, also known as the Comintern. So without further ado, Roger will start 30 to 40 minutes, I presume, as usual, or a bit longer if you want. And then comrades can come in, ask questions or make comments. Thank you.
Okay, 1 second, comrades. Right, good evening, comrades. The history of the Third International is, of course, inextricable from the history of the Russian Revolution, from its inspiring beginning to its bitter end, its birth, its crises, its corruption and decay, and its eventual strangulation. Yet the International was the product of a continental-wide revolution, the like of which had never been seen before. In this series, we've looked so far at the creation of the First and Second Internationals. The first was brought to an end by the crushing of the Paris Commune, the second by an even more catastrophic defeat, the First World War. This time we're focusing on how it was that once again, even sooner than its predecessor, a new international could arise from the ashes so soon. It's now 80 years since the death of the Communist International, and despite valiant efforts and not a few cheap imitations, nothing comparable has arisen in its place. That makes the project of a single party of the world working class look today like a romantic pipe dream, a mirage, or worse still, the obsession of sectarian cranks. But that's not how it always seemed. As explained in previous talks in this series, the Times compared the creation of the First International to the birth of Christianity. Engels considered the foundation of the Socialist International the final consummation of his and Marx's life work. On the eve of the world's first international May Day general strike, if you remember, he considered it the consummation of his life's work and wrote, if only Marx was still by my side to see this with his own eyes. And to millions around the world, the new international, the third, was not just no dream, it was the most vital factor in their lives. Just as the main base of the First International was in Britain, where Marx and Engels worked alongside the London Trades Council, and the second in Germany, where a thriving mass Marxist Social Democratic Party was being built, so too the Third International was created in Russia by the world's first successful proletarian revolution. And the rise and fall of the International is inseparable from the victory and then the decline and decay of the Russian Revolution. It was not at all fanciful or utopian for the Russian workers to see their revolution as the beginning of a new stage in human history, a new world. It was absolutely reasonable to see their struggle in the context of a Europe-wide revolution. After all, only 5 years previously, in November 1912, the Socialist International, not a sect if you remember, but the established voice of the organized working class throughout Europe and beyond, with a total membership in the 4 main combatant nations alone, Germany, Austria, Britain, and France, close to 3 million, and the support of 7 million voters, had conjured up the spectre of the Paris Commune and the 1905 revolution, unanimously warning the ruling classes of Europe, let them remember, they thundered, that the Franco-German War was followed by the revolutionary outbreak of the Commune, that the Russo-Japanese War set in motion the revolutionary forces of the peoples of the Russian Empire. And perhaps few of the delegates who enthusiastically endorsed this resolution had understood quite how uncannily accurate it was. Because as we discussed in last week's session, Lenin had considered himself a champion of the mainstream of the International and an ally of Kautsky in resisting the revisionist heresies of Bernstein, the prophet of reformism. In exile in Switzerland, Lenin was literally incredulous when he saw the front page of Vorwärts, the SPD newspaper, reporting on their support for the Kaiser's war credits in the Reichstag. And as we comrades will remember, he assumed that this must be a forgery by the German General Staff. So at this critical hour, the workers now found themselves politically disarmed. Amid the blood and horror of World War, and on the eve of revolutionary upheavals dwarfing those of 1848, they found themselves left leaderless. And in these dark years, the spirit of socialist internationalism remained only in the minds of a handful of isolated individuals. The new International was conceived in 1915, when a handful of socialists opposed to the war gathered together in Zimmerwald in Switzerland. The Zimmerwald left, that's the revolutionary wing, numbered a grand total of 8 delegates. At the Comintern conference the following year, it had increased its strength by half to 12. And yet only a year later, the workers were already in power in Russia and the new International was being built. For lo and behold, in actual fact, within months of the end of the war, revolution really was raging, not just in Russia, but throughout Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, France, and other countries too. The royal dynasties of Europe were toppled one by one. The Romanovs of Russia, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, and the Habsburgs of Austria, all tossed into oblivion. And as for the Gotha-Saxe-Coburg dynasty in Britain, which had just hastily anglicized its name to Windsor, following the overthrow of his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm, it was fear of his own imminent dethronement that prompted King George V to refuse sanctuary to yet another cousin, Tsar Nicholas, and abandon him to his fate, summary execution in Russia. By the way, all 3 monarchs were grandchildren of Queen Victoria. And that too was no idle threat. Britain saw the general strike on the Clyde, the mutinies among the British forces in France, the Triple Alliance of trade unions, and the mass councils of action which sprang up expressly to defend the Russian Revolution and impede the intervention. Councils which Lenin called Soviets in essence, if not in name. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George wrote in a confidential memorandum, "The whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution." The mass of participants in the Russian Revolution then understood that they were part of an international event. On the very day of the October Revolution, the resolution of the Petrograd Soviet declared that, quote, "The proletariat of the countries of Western Europe will aid us in conducting the cause of socialism to a real and lasting victory." And in his classic eyewitness account, the American journalist John Reed recorded the common thoughts of ordinary working-class Petrograd insurgents on the streets. Again, a quote, "Now there was all great Russia to win, and then the world." Then the historic proclamation made the next day to the Congress of Soviets ended with an explicit call to the workers of Britain, France, and Germany to, quote, "help us to bring to a successful conclusion the cause of the liberation of the exploited working masses from all slavery and exploitation." Lenin addressed the delegates with the prediction that revolution will soon break out in all the belligerent countries. Trotsky warned that if Europe continues to be ruled by the imperialist bourgeoisie, revolutionary Russia will inevitably be lost. Either the Russian Revolution will create a revolutionary moment in Europe, or the European powers will destroy the Russian Revolution. Reed reports that they greeted him with an immense crusading acclaim. Reed even quotes a Red Guard who, again, quote, "plied me with questions about America. Are the American workers ready to overthrow the capitalists?" And a soldier fresh from the front who said, "We will hold the fort with all our strength until the peoples of the world arise." And he then addresses Reed directly, "Tell the American workers to rise and fight for the social revolution." Reed commented, "Something was kindled in these men. One spoke of the coming world revolution, of which we are the advanced guard. Another of the new age of brotherhood, when all the peoples will become one great family." Therefore, we can see the new International grew out of worldwide solidarity with the Russian workers and soldiers. 21 foreign armies had poured into Russia in a concerted attempt to crush the revolution in its cradle. At one point, only a small area surrounding Moscow and extending barely to Petrograd had been in the hands of the Red Army. and Russia, of course, was starved of arms. But the Bolsheviks had greeted the enemy soldiers with leaflets printed in all their languages, explaining that they had been sent by their bosses to crush the Workers' Republic, reporting the news of the revolution raging throughout Europe, and appealing for active help. This had an immediate effect on the foreign troops of the intervention, themselves war-weary workers in uniform. It was therefore the power of workers' internationalism that saved the Russian Revolution. There were mutinies in the French fleet stationed off Odessa and in the British, German, Czechoslovak and other armies. In Britain, in September 19, the TUC condemned the Siberian occupation, and Siberia was evacuated within days. Councils of action had sprung up throughout Britain to defend the Russian Revolution. In May 1920, the men in London's East India docks refused to load the ship, the Jolly George, with hidden caches of arms. Mass demonstrations were held throughout the country, and a joint meeting of the TUC, the Labour Party, NEC, and the Parliamentary Labour Party threatened a general strike. General Golovin reported on his negotiations with Winston Churchill in May 1919 as follows: "The question of giving armed support was for him the most difficult one. The reason for this was the opposition of the British working class to armed intervention." So the intervention failed at indescribable cost, beaten back by a combination of superhuman self-sacrifice. A total of 19 million citizens were deployed, at least 6.5 million workers and peasants mobilized in the Red Army, and of solidarity strikes, mutinies and sabotage on the part of the world's working class. For the moment, the revolution survived. So it's impossible to explain the creation of the Communist International in isolation from the tidal wave of revolution that brought it into life. No one studying the history of that time could doubt the global consciousness of its participants and the spirit of internationalist solidarity pulsing through the veins and embodied in the words of its leaders. And I'm just going to emphasize this one last time. Lenin emphasized that without aid from the international world revolution, he said, a victory of the proletarian revolution is impossible. We did our utmost to preserve the Soviet system under any circumstances and at all costs, because we knew that we are working not only for ourselves, but also for the international revolution. In March 1918, he wrote that there could be no hope of the ultimate victory of our revolution if it were to remain alone. If the German Revolution doesn't come, we are doomed. In the emergency debate in 1918 over whether or not to seek a peace treaty with Germany, Lenin had even said, if the German movement is capable of developing at once in the event of peace negotiations, we ought to sacrifice ourselves, since the German Revolution will be far more powerful than ours. It is not open to the slightest doubt that the final victory of our revolution, if it were to remain alone, if there were no revolutionary movement in other countries, would be hopeless. Our salvation from all these difficulties is an all-European revolution. The supreme task, therefore, was the foundation of the Communist International, the World Party of Socialist Revolution. So, with workers' governments already in power in Russia and briefly in Hungary and Bavaria too, the new International was founded in March 1919. Now, since there's been a lot of dust thrown into people's eyes by the enemies of the revolution, we have to answer the question, why was it necessary to declare war on the parties of the old International and build a third International? Had there not been debates raging within the Second International for years without anyone posing the need to split the organization? And the answer is that the nature of the discussion had changed. The argument was now being conducted in very different language, not in speeches, resolutions, and debates across the conference chamber, but in bullets, bombs, and war. The debate between the old and the new internationals was being waged in blood, not just on the battlefields of the Russian Civil War, but across the barricades throughout Europe. Ebert, Noske, and Scheidemann, leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, were mobilizing and arming the Freikorps, the paramilitary gangster battalions and prototypes of the Nazis who murdered revolutionary workers, soldiers, and sailors, among them Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, heroes of the German proletariat. James Connolly, Irish revolutionary and co-leader of the Easter Rising, was wheeled from a hospital bed, strapped to a chair, and shot by firing squad on the orders of a British war cabinet, which included the Labour Party leader, Arthur Henderson. Social democratic leaders were enthusiastically supporting the invasion of revolutionary Russia by no fewer, as I've said, than 21 foreign counter-revolutionary armies. Mensheviks, former fellow members alongside Lenin and Trotsky of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, were collaborating with Tsarist White Guards and foreign mercenaries in the Russian Civil War. And let's not forget that following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks really had, in fact, not only offered a united front, but actually handed over ministerial portfolios in a coalition government with the left social revolutionaries. But now it was a left social revolutionary who fired shots at Lenin and almost succeeded in assassinating him. So there's a widespread misconception that the foundation of the Communist International was some kind of ultra-left sectarian indulgence. And this myth later seemed to gain some superficial substance from subsequent developments, the incipient rash of immature ultra-leftism that did taint some of the early communist parties, the impression of ultimatism given by the new international famous 21 conditions for membership, which I'm coming to in a moment, its proclamation of a permanent ban on certain named prominent individuals, its practice, and later under Stalin, outright abuse of the principle of democratic centralism, and later, grossly and criminally, Stalin's adoption at a critical time of a monstrously lunatic adventurism in branding the Social Democrats social fascists, and as we will see, actually colluding with the Nazis to split the German working class and thus ensure its annihilation. So the truth is different. Lenin and Trotsky could not reasonably be accused of having split the International because there was no International to split. Since the 1912 Congress of the Socialist International, for all its ringing declarations and stern warnings to the ruling classes, it never met again, not once. From 1914 to 1918, the hundreds of thousands of workers owing allegiance to this mass international were meeting together, not at international conferences, as I've said, to debate resolutions, but in rival army uniforms on the battlefields of Europe to slaughter one another by the millions, on the express instructions and the direct decision of the leaders of the now disintegrated international's respective national sections. So even formally speaking, the Socialist International was legally dissolved in 1916. Not only, therefore, was there no organization to split from, there was at that stage no splinter remaining of its constituent parts. Not for the first time, nor for the last. For a period, the International survived, as I've said, only in the persons of scattered individuals or small groups. As we've said, in the little gatherings in Timmerwald in 1915, in Comintern the following year. So should they not have held these secret meetings during the war? And if so, what for, if not to plan the creation of new parties capable of overthrowing the ruling class? And once the war was over, mainly due to the flood of revolution and mutiny afflicting the belligerent powers, should the Timmerwald left have then quietly dissolved? Or were they right to resolve to build a new international on the ashes of the old? Could anyone seriously suggest that at this time the new international could have offered a united front with these traitors of 1914, even if they'd wanted to? Did the Bolsheviks make mistakes? Yes, of course. Bertolt Brecht once suggested that revolutionaries should now and again publish a list of their past mistakes so as to protect themselves against accusations that they're always claiming to be right. So, if you like, here's a list. Lenin's earlier formulation of the tasks of the coming Russian Revolution had been imprecise or algebraic, as Trotsky put it. Trotsky acknowledged his own mistake in, notwithstanding these earlier differences, remaining outside the Bolshevik faction. Lenin was mistaken in supporting the Red Army's invasion of Poland. Trotsky took a mistaken position on the trade union question in 1921. Will this do for a start? But one thing Lenin and Trotsky were definitely not wrong about was to rescue the tradition of workers' internationalism by founding the Communist International in 1919. Far from splitting the International, what they did was to rebuild the International out of the rubble of the World War after its old leaders had smashed it to smithereens. It is those same criminal leaders, stained with the blood of millions of loyal workers slaughtered in the war, who were guilty of splitting the International by their betrayal. So the most important question to begin with for us is, who formed the Communist International? Was it a collection of misfits and rebels? Did it grow out of fringe sects? On the contrary, it was in the same mold and tradition as the First International, which was an alliance of all genuine working class organizations, and the Second International, which had brought together all mass social democratic parties and initially trade union organizations too. Far from a coven of sectarians, the new International had a truly mass base. Conference after conference voted to affiliate to the Communist International. So what was its composition? The Russian Bolsheviks, who numbered hundreds of thousands and had constituted the majority of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. From Germany, the majority wing of the Independents, who had been the proletarian backbone of the old Social Democratic Party. The French Socialist Party, at its Tours conference in 1921, voted to affiliate en bloc to the Third International. The Italian Socialist Party at its conference voted to affiliate. The Norwegian Labour Party affiliated. The Swedish Left Socialists, who came from the Social Democratic Party, affiliated. The Swiss Socialist Party at its conference voted to affiliate. The Hungarian Social Democrats amalgamated with the Communist Party. The Bulgarian Social Democrats affiliated. The majority of the Czechoslovak Social Democrats affiliated. The Socialist Party of the USA, in a referendum, voted to affiliate. There were even mass trade union organizations such as the Spanish CGT, the Italian Syndicalists, and the South Wales Miners' Federation, which affiliated directly to the Communist International. So the list of affiliates to the new International reads like a roll call of former members of the Second International. In some cases, of course, there were maneuvers by the bureaucratic leaders of the old parties to obstruct this movement. The decision of the Swiss Socialist Party conference was reversed after a referendum. The leaders of the American Socialist Party rejected the decision of the membership. The leaders of the Czechoslovak Social Democrats postponed their conference when it became clear that they would vote to affiliate. And the Hungarian Social Democrats later split away again. But they could not stop the tidal wave of workers flooding towards the new International. Whatever the machinations of the old leaders in obstructing, reversing, or derailing the process, or whatever mistakes were made by the left, the birth of a new mass revolutionary international was secured. Of course, at indescribable cost. For the moment, the revolution survived. The capitalist chain around the globe had broken, the world revolution had begun, but it was at its weakest link that the imperialist chain had snapped. The most revolutionary working class in the world had taken power earliest in a country of age-old backwardness, with little industry, low productivity, long hours, mass illiteracy, a per capita income about 1/10 of that of the USA. Less than 10% of the population were wage earners, and a far smaller proportion were heavy industrial workers. It's important to put in context the objective situation in Russia at the time. 3 years of savage civil war were to aggravate conditions still further. In 1921, industrial production was down to 1/9 of the 1913 level. Agricultural produce had slipped below the pre-1900 level. 7 million homeless waifs roamed the country. The people were starving. Peasants thirsting for private land at fair prices were becoming restive once the immediate danger of Tsarist restoration had been removed, and the country had been forced to the stark emergency restrictions of war communism. Communism in a besieged fortress, as Trotsky described it. So these were conditions not of socialism, but of almost of barbarism. Grain requisitioning at bayonet point, famine which brought in its wake cases even of cannibalism, malaria, over hasty nationalization, payment in kind, militarization of labor, the scarcity of finance, technical expertise, and spare parts. This was all the terrible price paid to save the Soviet Republic. The country was already steeped in age-old backwardness with only pockets of industry, so it was plagued with mass starvation, deadly epidemics, a desperate scarcity of finance. Years of civil war and unremitting hardship had sapped the energies of the generation of October. So that was the stark conditions in which the International was born. The first Congress of the Communist International was probably about the same size as this meeting today. Although, to be fair, on the other hand, the workers were already in power in 3 countries then. It met in Moscow in March 1919 in extreme conditions of siege and civil war. Only 51 delegates attended. Actually, according to the commentary of Braunstein, only 44. And again, according to him, only 5 delegates had actually made it from outside Russia. That was from Germany, Austria, Sweden, Norway, and Holland. Due to the international blockade, no one made it from Italy, France, Britain, or the USA. And due to these hazards, many of those who did participate arrived late. There was a German delegate who was arrested at the border. And of course, a major item on the agenda was should the International be founded there at all. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, potentially the Lenin and Trotsky of the coming German Revolution, had been assassinated only weeks beforehand. The German delegation conveyed their strong reservations about the viability of an international on so unstable a foundation. It was only with difficulty persuaded to abstain rather than oppose the immediate proclamation of the International. And on one level, they were, of course, right. Russia in 1919 hardly offered a stable or reliable foundation on which to build the headquarters of the world revolution. It would be hard to conceive of a more precarious base on which to rest the fate of the world working class. The Russian Revolution was clinging on by its fingertips. The idea that it could survive in any shape whatsoever, no matter how grotesquely warped or stunted, had occurred to no one, least of all Lenin or Trotsky. The establishment of the headquarters of the new International in Russia, therefore, was nothing more than a holding operation pending the imminent victory of the working class in Germany, Europe, and beyond. By the time of the Second Congress, which met in Petrograd in July and August 1920, still, by the way, at the height of a raging civil war and multiple foreign invasions, there were nevertheless 218 delegates present from 37 countries. In fact, so popular was the International already becoming that its leaders had to take special precautions to ensure that it avoided the risk of dilution into a new version of the Second International. The IEC conference resolution stated, quote, "The Communist International is becoming to some extent fashionable. There is a danger of dilution by unstable and irresolute elements which have not yet completely discarded the ideology of the Second International." One second. I've lost my place. 1 second, sorry. Yes, all the more reason then for special measures to immunize the new organism against the danger of contamination. That is why the new International laid down its famous 21 conditions, strict conditions explicitly rejecting in advance from future prospective membership a list of known named individuals who would be permanently ineligible. Again, to quote the resolution, the Communist International cannot tolerate a situation where notorious opportunists, as represented by Turati, Modigliani, Kautsky, Hilferding, Hilkvit, Longe, MacDonald, etc., have the right to pass as members of the Communist International. This could only lead to the Communist International becoming something very similar to the wreck of the Second International. I think we'd all agree it would be an enjoyable pastime to draw up our own list of vetoes of prospective candidates to be refused admission to our own future international today. Was this sectarianism? In the conditions of the time, no, it was a tribute to the power and principle of the leadership of the new international that they were prepared to sacrifice alluring superficial gains in order to maintain their revolutionary traditions intact, without at the same time falling into the trap of sectarianism. Rather than accept Turati into the Communist International, they were prepared to split the Italian Socialist Party. Rather than make concessions on the principle of a central international discipline, they were prepared to lose the affiliation of the Norwegian Labour Party in 1923. That's how they built what remained for now a genuine international. At the third Congress in June and July 1921, there were 509 delegates, rising to 603 from 48 countries. But already by that time, the tide of history was beginning to turn against the revolution, and Lenin and Trotsky only with difficulty succeeded in curbing the adventurist exuberance of an ultra-left majority. Lenin stated openly that it was necessary to make, as he put it, a turn to the right. Trotsky soon afterwards described the change in the objective situation between the first two congresses of the Communist International and the second two. In 1919 and 1920, he wrote, it was, quote, considered virtually self-evident that the constantly rising and intensifying political ferment of the masses, growing out of the social paroxysms of the war, must lead directly to the conquest of power by the proletariat. By the time of the third Congress, he wrote, the tempo of development proved to be different. War did not lead directly to the victory of the proletariat in Western Europe. It is all too obvious just what was lacking for victory in 1919 and 1920. A revolutionary party was lacking. Not until the powerful post-war mass ferment had already begun to ebb did young communist parties begin to take shape, and then only in rough outline. So Germany was now the key to the class balance of forces. It was in the throes of wild and violent fluctuations, from the mass general strikes and military and naval mutinies that had overthrown the ruling dynasty and brought an end to the war, to the mobilization of the fascist paramilitary Freikorps and its rampage of terror, to the attempted monarchist putsch led by Kapp, to his humiliation and disarmament at the hands of the workers of Berlin, to a new wave of strikes, occupations, and uprisings. And the crucial test came in 1923. Germany was by now racked in intense and unprecedented crisis. Hyperinflation had soared to the extent that a wheelbarrow full of banknotes would hardly buy a box of matches. French and Belgian armies had occupied the industrial heartland in the Ruhr. The Nazis made their first attempted putsch in Munich, and the working class was ready for insurrection. In this situation, what was missing was the insight and strategic leadership that had saved the Russian Revolution. This was a crucial historic turning point. The failure of the International, reflecting the ebbing revolutionary mood within Russia, and in a state of retreat, isolation, and hostile encirclement, bitter concessions have become unavoidable to foreign companies, native entrepreneurs, rich peasants, kulaks, net men, i.e. profiteers, and a privileged caste of state and party bureaucrats. Vile elements were crawling out of the crevices once the harsh regime of war communism had been replaced by a new economic policy under which painful concessions had been wrung out of the government, permitting a limited license to private entrepreneurs. And worse still, in the extreme conditions of a backward and isolated Russia, there was no alternative but to enlist the services of the administrative personnel of the old Tsarist regime, luring them back by conceding to them a relaxation on the limit of their payment to allow, initially, a maximum wage differential of 4-1, which soon, under Stalin, of course, swelled beyond control, a concession which was already, frankly, admitted by Lenin to be a capitalist differential. That's what Lenin meant when he complained that we still have the same old Tsarist state machine today with the thin veneer of socialism spread on top. So I'm putting this in the context. We have to understand the process that was of degeneration that was taking place in Russia as a backdrop to the failure of the revolutionary parties, so the sections of the Comintern, under the leadership of a growing bureaucratic clique. So demoralized at the isolation of their revolution and nauseated by the antics of the netmen and kulaks and profiteers and black marketeers, and taunted by the return of a triumphant bureaucracy, it's hardly surprising that the Russian working class was falling under the darkening shadow of a new form of despotism. And in such conditions, the party drowned in a cesspool of careerism. It was a sly and ambitious mediocrity Stalin, previously described as a grey blur and a perfect personification of the resurgent bureaucracy, who surreptitiously accumulated more and more administrative power into its own hands. So the dead hand of the growing bureaucracy within Russia had already begun to stifle the creative revolutionary spirit of the International. By November, the German Revolution had been derailed. As Trotsky described it, the revolution failed not because it generally had not matured, but because the decisive link, the leadership, dropped out of the chain at the decisive moment. Because even that brilliant creation of the revolutionary workers was destroyed by the terrible era of reaction which followed. It was obstinate bureaucratic blunders that derailed the revolution in Germany in 1923. Opportunist maneuvers to conciliate the trade union bureaucracy in Britain in 1926, fatal concessions to the capitalist Comintern in China in 1927, which led to a bloodbath of communists, all of which opened up a new dark age of worldwide counter-revolution, which rotted the Communist International from within. The treacherous policy of socialism in one country, which destroyed the International, was rooted in the material privileges of the bureaucratic clique in Russia, and the survival of that parasitical clique was due in turn to the isolation of the revolution to backward Russia and the advance of world reaction. So from 1924, the watchword of the Communist International was socialism in one country. In other words, the explicit antithesis of communist internationalism embodied in the very name of their organization. It came to mean appeasement of capitalism everywhere else. The Communist International became nothing more, therefore, than an unofficial arm of Soviet state diplomacy, its every section subservient not to the interests and revolutionary aspirations of its respective working class, but to the episodic and cynical twists and turns of Soviet foreign policy. The Comintern was reduced from vanguard of the world revolution to frontier guard of the USSR. Thus, its policy was forcibly subordinated to the interests of the treacherous trade union bureaucracy in Britain, which portrayed a general strike which was developing day by day a more explicitly revolutionary character, or to the nascent Chinese capitalist class, which proceeded to drown the insurgent communist workers in a bloodbath. And from this strategy of blatant class collaboration, the by now thoroughly Stalinist or Stalinized Comintern switched to an even more appalling policy, which fatally split the working class and doomed it to its most catastrophic defeat in history. It was Trotsky, once again, who strenuously opposed with every fiber of his being the lunatic, grotesquely ultra-left caricature of Bolshevism later practiced by Stalin and his puppets in their proclamation of what they termed their so-called third period, when they refused to stand together with the Social Democrats in a workers' united front against fascism, and instead made a dirty deal with the fascists, forged a bloc with the Nazis, and denounced the Social Democrats as, quote, social fascists, itself a ridiculous pantomime comic opera name. In Germany and worldwide, the main enemy of the working class was declared to be not the growing counter-revolutionary army of actual fascists hell-bent on annihilation of the entire labor movement, but these so-called social fascists, the Social Democrats. The Stalinists openly colluded with the Nazis, for instance, in the so-called Red Referendum to depose the Social Democratic government of Prussia. The millions of German workers with their revolutionary traditions were fatally divided, with the result that the world's strongest communist party outside Russia was utterly pulverized and destroyed. In January 1933, Hitler was enabled to take power and imposed the most brutal and bloodthirsty regime of terror and torture and repression, crushing the working class under the jackboot of fascism without encountering even a trace of workers' resistance, a catastrophe which was actually celebrated by the Stalinists as a step towards socialist revolution. So the Comintern have by now become so distorted by the interests of the Stalinist bureaucracy that the workers were led like lambs to the slaughter to this crushing defeat, a defeat more catastrophic even than the betrayal of 1914. The destruction of the world's strongest labour movement without even a fight was actually celebrated by the Comintern, as I've said, as a victory along the road towards socialism. Policing, bullying and wholesale expulsions by the bureaucracy had turned the whole movement into a tame lapdog of the Kremlin clique. From that time on, any hope of reforming the International and restoring its revolutionary traditions was gone forever. So the violent oscillations of Soviet diplomacy had led to a dizzying succession of ever more disastrous tactics. As I've said, switching from appeasement of first the British trade union bureaucrats, then the Chinese capitalists, to treacherous denunciations of other workers' parties and open collusion with the Nazis. And now the Comintern was to perform yet another somersault. The establishment of broad counter-revolutionary Popular Front alliances, not only with those social democratic workers' parties that it had so recently denounced as social fascists, but with the mainstream capitalist, liberal, and pseudo-democratic parties of the ruling class. But then, of course, later, once again, they performed another volte-face and concluded a straight military and diplomatic alliance with Hitler at the outset of the Second World War. Inside Russia, the debate had by now been brutally terminated with the slaughter of an entire generation of Bolsheviks. Millions perished in the purges and in Stalin's gulags, and millions more were led to slavery and genocide in the hellish concentration camps of fascist Europe. The Comintern had become the greatest single obstacle to the socialist revolution, cynically betraying the workers in one country after another into the hands of their executioners. And of course, inevitably, in 1943, this led inexorably to its only possible logical conclusion, the formal dissolution of the Comintern in deference to Stalin's new allies, Roosevelt and Churchill. And Stalinist apologists used their virtuoso skills of tortuous trickery to explain this away in exemplary dialectical language. The struggle had, it seems, outgrown the old organizational forms. And hadn't even Karl Marx, after all, dissolved the First International in 1872? So the Communist International was doomed because it too was incapable of withstanding the overwhelming pressures of history, its isolation amid the ebb of the revolution. It was at its weakest link, as we've said, that the imperialist chain had snapped. What is surprising is not that the revolution went on to suffer gross, hideous, monstrous distortions and survived as a grossly mangled caricature under the jackboot of a loathsome ruling clique of parasites, but that it was not immediately overthrown and crushed underfoot by a victorious imperialism. That last act of the tragedy was, of course, still to come only decades later, with the theft of Russia's resources by a new gangster kleptocracy. But that is not the end of the story. Was the International adventuristic? Was it a failed gamble? Or was it, despite its tragic ultimate fate, at its peak, the noblest and most heroic product of socialist working class solidarity? And what are the prospects for its rebirth on a new foundation? Why is it that despite periodic resurgence of revolutionary struggle, and today, perhaps on an incomparably broader canvas, mobilizing tens of millions in every continent across the globe, why have no direct organizational links so far been forged? Is the era of workers' internationalism now consigned to history? That's a story, the end of which is for the new generations to determine. Well, thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. I think you know the answer. It's not too late, and we'll revive the international working class movement. I'm hoping it's a hope mainly, rather than judging by anything that's going on at the moment. Thank you very much, Roger. Very interesting session. Interesting to divide it up into different stages, and I think I agree with you quite a lot in terms of defending the beginnings of the Comintern for sure, coming out of the defeat of the Second International and having learned some lessons there in terms of the Social Democrats, being too social democratic, too reformist, etc., and need to be challenged. There could be perhaps an argument over timings. I think when do you think the rot started, etc., etc. I think we'll leave that to discussion if anybody wants to come in on that. There are some disagreements on that, but interesting also on the 21 conditions is something we could discuss if comrades want to come in. That's not always uncritically viewed on the left, the 21 conditions, but I also think it's not a sign of sectarianism, but was quite necessary to appeal to actual communists not to be to form their own communist parties and to not go down the social democratic road. And I don't mean the SPD road, I mean the actual social democratic road. Now, before I open up for contributions from the floor, I think I speak in everybody's name by passing on greetings of solidarity to Tony Greenstein, a very regular contributor and visitor of these sessions, who's just been found guilty of various things, various offences, caught in Wolverhampton for a part he played in Palestine action. It wasn't actually an action yet. They were planning an action, and I can't say too much about it to not get him in trouble or us in trouble, but it was a shambles, an undemocratic, terrible shambles, this court case where the defense was not allowed to speak to justifications or to motive. So it was simply about, the actual act, what you were planning on doing. Weren't allowed to talk about mass murder in Palestine, the oppression of Palestinians, etc., and why they were doing what they were doing. So absolutely shocking that you're not allowed to even talk about that. So greetings of solidarity with Tony, and we're discussing with him how we can best support him. So watch this space. So comrades, there's been a bit of discussion in the chat about timings, what Trotsky did wrong, what others did wrong. Please raise your hand and come in, enlighten us all, ask questions. No question is too stupid, no comment is wrong. We're all comrades here, and we want to have discussions with you. And this is a period which is hugely important, seeing as it was the first organized effort to organize the revolutionary proletariat across the world. And they took a lot of lessons from the Paris Commune and trying to avoid what happened to the Paris Commune by spreading the revolution internationally. The first comrade to come in is Ian Spencer, please. But other comrades, please put your hand up, ask questions, make a contribution. Okay, are you there, Ian? Sorry, it takes a little while to become a panelist. There he is. Oh, and he's gone again. There you are again.
Yeah, I'm only playing. Good evening, comrades. Roger, thank you. That was excellent. I thoroughly enjoyed that. A brilliant presentation. In common with a few other people, I dare say we'll have disagreements about exactly where the rots are in. Can I draw attention to the Treaty of Rapallo, as I have done before in other sessions, which is 1922. So here's the Soviet Union entering into a trade agreement with the Germany that had murdered the German Revolution drowned it in blood. And already by 1920, arguably, another mechanism is taking place here by which the Soviet Union has to survive. Now, I can understand why you would say, well, yes, but the young Soviet Republic needed that trade, needed to be able to survive economically. But of course, isn't coincidental. I mean, you know, Mussolini takes power in 1922, and just as you're absolutely right to draw attention to the fact that the revolution wasn't confined to the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1922, but the counter-revolution had already set in by 1922. So I simply throw this out as an honest question. I don't have a particular stance on it. Where would you say that the degeneration started, and is there a mechanism taking place? Because the tendency is to talk of the failure of leadership. Well, in fact, there seems to, if there's a failure of leadership, then it was a failure of leadership in a wide range of different countries. And is that because all the leaders were utterly useless, or because there was actually something else going on? That in fact there was a underestimation of just how bad social democratic parties had been by that time, and the extent to which the proletariat was truly ready. Of course, we can't know these things, and it's all very well in hindsight, and I fully accept that. And for the record, I still think they should have done it. You know, still think that you couldn't know at the time, and you would have had to have gone for it, knowing that it could have been the spark of world revolution. But nevertheless, if we're being truthful to the legacy of Marx and Engels, we have to think about where it went wrong and why it went wrong, and it can't be just down to a crisis of leadership. Thank you, comrades.
Do you want to answer this, Roger?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a very relevant pertinent question. But if you say, when did the degeneration start? I mean, what I was trying to emphasize is that not at the very beginning, it was not possible to create a model Soviet socialist democracy, if you like. It was Lenin and Trotsky, if you like, were strained every nerve in order to maintain the principle of including the most draconic provisions to guard against bureaucratism, the imposition of limits on the pay of bureaucrats, if you like, of workers, of officials, if you like, but which were actually limited to the wage of a skilled worker at the beginning. The conscious mobilization of the population in administrative tasks and so on. But remember, from the very beginning, they were fighting a civil war, a savage, ferocious civil war for 3 years, with 21 foreign armies invading the territory of the Soviet Union. So it was, as I said, it was a holding operation. It was not created as a kind of model socialist paradise. It was created as a desperate measure to hold on to what was there, which they could never have conceived that they could, even in a mangled and bureaucratically distorted way, they couldn't have conceived, Lenin and Trotsky, that the revolution could have survived in any form whatsoever, however misshapen. And it's an incredible testament, if you like, to the rottenness of capitalism, that it did survive, and of course to the solidarity of the working class, that it did survive in any form whatsoever. But very soon, of course, they had to make concessions, which were, frankly, as Lenin said, a capitalist differential, when he allowed even just a maximum differential of officials to the average skilled workers' wage of 4 to 1. Even that, they had to bribe the old Tsarist officials who were fleeing the country and emigrated. They had to. Trotsky had to use the resources of the old Tsarist officer caste, as we know, in the Civil War. It was not by any means a kind of idyll for any, even for a day, even for a week. It was socialism in a besieged fortress, as I think Trotsky described it. So treaties, deals, concessions, all of those were forced upon the young Soviet Republic because they were desperate just to survive long enough until the world revolution came to their rescue and it could be spread to more fertile and healthy and productive ground. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does.
Okay.
But let's briefly, before we bring in other comrades, because this touches on why did the German Revolution not happen, which is what Lenin had high hopes for, and as you say, he and the other Bolsheviks were saying, we'll never survive alone. We're doing this in the knowledge, in the understanding that the German working class will make revolution very, very soon, and that will change everything. And I'd forgotten about this quote you mentioned, that we will sacrifice ourselves if that means the German revolution can go ahead, which is interesting because it was so important at the time, Germany at the heart of imperialism and capitalism in Europe. I mean, there's obviously Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were killed, but they were killed after they tried it once or twice already, and there were differences as well, weren't there? And there's a sort of discussion about, was the Communist Party formed too late in Germany? Was that the reason? Was it impatience by especially Karl Liebknecht? Him and Rosa clashed a few times in terms of, the workers weren't quite ready for the uprising, Luxemburg argued, but Liebknecht did it anyway, and then she had to help out and get involved, etc. And there was a bit of tension there. What, in your view, went wrong? I think we all agree that, had it happened, we would be in a totally different situation potentially today worldwide. It could have changed history entirely, and it was on a knife's edge. This is really important to understand, that things could look very, very different very, very quickly. In your assessment, what was the big thing that stopped the German Revolution from happening, if you have a theory on it?
Well, actually, there's so much, such a wealth of history to go through. I suggest sometime it might be a very good idea to have a session on the German Revolution itself. But obviously the revolution of 1918 was a full-scale workers' uprising, the soldiers, the sailors, the working class, and absolutely a tidal wave ran through Germany. But no party was in existence yet which was able to give a direction and a focus to that revolutionary mood, and therefore the power fell into the lap of these parasitical bureaucrats at the head of the already discredited Social Democratic Party. But by 1923, I mean, again and again there've been waves of revolution. The defeat of the Kapp Putsch, for instance, which had in many ways has a parallel with the rout of Kornilov in August 1917 in Russia. The way that the army of the counter-revolution just melted away once the working class had stepped onto the scene and confronted the counter-revolution. But 1923, I mean, I referred to some of the conditions at the time, a complete collapse of any kind of social civilization of any kind, you could say. I mean, the fact that the currency was worthless, that the country was being overrun by foreign armies, the French in the Ruhr, the threat of the putsch, if you like, that Hitler tried to operate in Munich. in all of those conditions, complete turmoil, complete meltdown of any kind of social cohesion, if you like. In that situation, the revolution was there for the making, and it was the fatal conservatism of the leadership of the Comintern, and that meant Stalin and Zinoviev and the others, that completely just completely wasted that opportunity, and that led to the desperation of particularly of the middle classes, of the ruined petty bourgeoisie and so on, which then became later with the new shocks of the Great Depression, which then created a mass base for fascism. So I would say 1923 was the crucial moment.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, please. Still muted.
Right, you should hear me now.
You are, there you are.
Good. Yeah, I'll take up just one or 2 points. It's the first time I've joined in this discussion, although I've commented on the sidelines in several of them. I'll take just a couple of points. Trotsky's mistakes were much deeper than Rogers made out. Terrorism and communism and the role and tasks of the trade unions suggested all power to the bureaucracy. And apparently Stalin so enjoyed terrorism and communism that he kept it by him as a regular good read. It's because you're starting from the wrong place. Lenin and Trotsky's fight against bureaucracy, of course they wanted to oppose it, but by bureaucratic means. It could never work. The only force that could destroy the bureaucracy was the working class. And that force had already been demobilized long before. So they couldn't actually fight that battle. But behind this is a completely different view of the role of the working class and the role of the party. The party there is a kind of ideological purity, which Roger refers to the perils of contamination. I would suggest that contamination is healthy to a healthy organism, absolutely essential to it in biological terms and in political terms. The working class always includes differences because we come from different places, different occupations, etc. So without expressing and making live those differences, you have an organization that's got to die. It cannot do it on the basis of some kind of search for ideological purity. The basis of revolutionary socialism is the working class, not an ideology. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you want to reply?
Yes, although of course I hope other comrades will come in as well on these questions, but my reply on that is, well, I did emphasize that Lenin and Trotsky did make mistakes. I even listed some of them. I think I mentioned Trotsky's mistake on the trade union question. If I didn't, I intended to, which is very much related to the questions that Jeff just asked. But we were talking about tactical decisions in emergency situations. This was not, the kind of works like terrorism and communism that you quoted, you referred to, were not kind of blueprints for a socialist society or for general handbooks of how revolutionaries conduct themselves. They were related to explicit, specific situations that existed at the time. Now, war communism which was the period really up to the end of the Civil War, 1920-21, or a little later, war communism was not, as I tried to say before, was not a workers' democracy. It was a very crude expression of I'm trying to think how to put this. It was an expression of workers' democracy in a situation in which none of the norms of workers' democracy could possibly allow for. In a period, as I say, I tried to describe, that's the reason I went into so much, literally, of people starving, literally, actually, even starvation to the extent that cannibalism existed. It was not the kind of maturing of a capitalist society towards takeover by a mass proletariat. It was communism in a besieged fortress, as Trotsky put it. The working class was a tiny, a very small minority in society, and it was the millions of people, as I said, had to be mobilized to fight in the Civil War against 21 foreign armies. Now, in that situation, it's just not reasonable. It's not rational to expect that there would be perfect norms of workers' democracy. But then, in particular, that was why in 1922-23, it was necessary to end the regime of war communism and to introduce, frankly, counter-revolutionary capitalist measures under the new economic policy to allow a flourishing within some kind of state controls, but to allow the flourishing of private enterprise, of both in the countryside and in the city, and of all the concessions that were needed. And that's why, for instance, the Treaty of Rapallo and the other concessions that were made to foreign imperialist powers too, they were forced as they were almost at gunpoint. They were forced by the isolation of the revolution to this very unfavorable terrain. I think I could go on more, but I think it might be better just to leave it at that. And if other comrades want to comment, they're welcome.
I mean, this is a really tricky question, isn't it? I mean, they didn't set out to have the revolution just in Russia. What do you do after you've succeeded and the others have all failed? It is a very difficult situation to consider. Mind you, terrorism and communism was written in 1920, so he was quite early in his defending terrorist measures. So it's not a great
in conditions of civil war. Remember.
Yeah. Okay. Anne.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Thank you, Roger. So my first question is, this session is entitled Marxism and the Third International, and therefore I want to ask what you think the Marxist lessons are, besides the fact that they were right to do it, which I think is your essential point. They were right to do it. From my point of view, I would say, and perhaps you agree with me, that the most important lesson is the complete disastrous nature of trying to build socialism in one country, and even to attempt to have a revolution in one country before the rest of the countries around you are ready. That's not to say that I think they were wrong to do it, but I'm just saying, I think for us, it should be to understand what happens when you get into that situation. Because here you had comrades, in the Bolsheviks in particular, doing things that they would never have dreamed of doing. I mean, you see how people are forced into taking actions that were completely against what they had stood for all along. So their key strategy all along was democracy, fighting for working class to take on the democratic tasks. And here you were after a revolution where you found yourself isolated, and the working class, you know, was more or less decimated in the Civil War. And, you know, then you're forced to take actions like introducing new economic policy, which I personally think was disastrous because it basically introduced a culture of petty bourgeois capitalism. It created enormous, it undermines the solidarity that did exist under war communism. And, you know, I'm not doubting war communism had incredibly terrible consequences, but there was no way of fixing the situation. Like if you read even E.H. Carr about, you know, say like even 1920, how they were trying to, you know, balance everything, you know, it was just emergency after emergency. So I think that you know, we have to recognize that, and that it's not one or two individuals' faults. And also I would say that it wasn't just Lenin and Trotsky. There were lots of other people involved in the Bolsheviks who are often, you know, unrecognized, but played an important role in the organization and in the International. I think actually I was recommending it to other comrades. There's a book out by Barbara Allen, who's written about Shlaplikov, you know, one of the leaders of the workers' opposition. And she's brought a book out, which is translations of all of the documents relating to the workers' opposition struggle in 1921. And what's interesting about it is that it throws light not just on the arguments of the workers' opposition, but on the situation that they faced at the time, which to me is very interesting, like to look at the context they were in, rather than setting them up against each other as, you know, this or that faction, you know, to see the situation all of the factions were in, because there were some people, you know, who were arguing for the workers' opposition just because they were fearful about what was happening to the Soviet state, the fact that it was disintegrating, well, not, that democracy, to the extent that democracy existed, where there wasn't very much, you're right, but that was disintegrating, and they were very fearful about what would happen. But I suppose, yeah, so that's one point. And my second point is, I think we need to also consider the richness of the International in terms of the other auxiliary bodies that were involved in it. And not only was there an international youth organization and the Red Trade Unions, but also, of course, there was the Communist Women's Movement, which is being has been researched, so we know far more about it now than we did before. And that was connected to the Zhenotdel, the women's department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which tried to do an enormous amount in a period which, like, was extremely difficult, and they probably pushed for far more than they could get. But what they tried to do in terms of Marxism was to put it into practice, and particularly the ideas of Engels and Bebel, to try to socialize domestic labor and childcare, give women independence, you know, get them involved in politics, all sorts of different initiatives, which were very difficult to do, but were worth doing. So I think to me, it's like something that, unless, and I agree, unless the revolution in Germany had succeeded, and that's a discussion for another day, I think, but unless that had succeeded, then it was bound to fail. But they did try, they were forced into doing things that they didn't ever want to do, but at the same time, they were still pushing ahead to do things that were unprecedented, particularly in terms of the laws that were passed, but like even further than that. So yeah, that's my comment. The Marxism, what are the lessons of Marxism to come out of that experience? Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Anne.
Well, like last week, Anne has really thrown a lot of light with her extensive sources. And thanks very much for that contribution. I don't disagree with anything you said.
Yeah, that's easy. Good. Okay. I'm bringing in Richard Harris now, who's also not spoken at our seminars before. Hi, Richard.
Hello. I just want to speak briefly about two things that Roger said, and it's a theme that's often repeated, but I think it's just false. Roger spoke about the Russians waiting for perhaps the Russian Revolution could be the spark of the world revolution, and that at another time the world revolution, they'd had to hang on in Russia until the world revolution would come to their aid. Well, I just find this bizarre, because I posted in the chat a link to an article by Louis Project in which he talks about German communist leaders meeting Lenin and Zinoviev at the Second World Congress. And Zinoviev points to a map which shows where Soviet forces were fighting in Poland, and said that it would be days until the Soviet forces were on the East Prussian border. And then Zinoviev asked, I think it was Levy directly, what form will the uprising take in East Prussia? And of course, the German delegates were completely astonished at this. They thought this was crazy. East Prussia was a conservative peasant area. There would be no uprising in support of the Soviets. There would actually be people banding together to drive them out. And Lenin asked Levy for his opinion on this. Levy didn't answer, and Lenin said in characteristic style, "It doesn't matter what you think, our Central Committee has a very different view of the matter." This is not working with the German communist leaders to build the world revolution. This is just Russian-centric. It's Russian-centric leadership. It's the formation of what we later see clearly as a Stalinist state, a bureaucratic military leadership from very early times in Soviet Russia. I don't see at all the sudden break in the 20s when Stalin took over, which is what Trotsky's point to. You know, I remind us that the Bolsheviks campaigned in 1917 under the slogans "Peace, Bread, Land." That's how they built support. Those slogans don't say world socialist revolution now. That's what we're here for. We want to be the spark of the world revolution. And of course, they broke obviously fairly early on with people like Julius Martov, who protested, the man whom Trotsky, of course, famously dismissed as that he should go into the dustbin of history, because of course he opposed the way in which the Leninist early state was forming. But let me just remind you, Martov in January 1918 wrote an article in the journal Dissent in Russia called, this is the title of the article, "Against the Bolshevik proposition that the independent trade unions are no longer necessary in the proletarian state." This is January 1918. One sees the steady formation of this bureaucratic military center that eventually flourished as Stalin's state. But one sees stepping stones all the way. The militarization of labor debate in 1921, the attack on Kronstadt, a proper socialist commune who dissented from the way in which the Soviet state was being led, with, of course, quite shocking lies being told by both Lenin and Trotsky about what was happening at Kronstadt, pretending that Kronstadt was a citadel of white forces, when, of course, two modern studies of Kronstadt, Getzler's and poor averages, say that Kronstadt was, if anything, dominated by communists and anarchists, people who wanted a Soviet Russia, but they didn't want a Russia dominated by the Communist Party. And during this whole period, we just get a whole pack of lies within the whole tradition of Leninism. Lenin and Trotsky tell us that the working class in Russia was wiped out at the end of the Civil War. But Murphy's book, Life in a Moscow Metal Factory, in which he conducted a careful study of the Guzon metal works, the largest factory in Moscow from about 1917 to 1927, says that the workforce there remained intact during the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War was not being fought by skilled metal workers. It was being fought by peasant youth. They were being sent out, whilst the skilled working class in Russia stayed at work, making those factories turn. I think the whole, Roger's presentation, which is obviously very influenced by Trotsky, more or less comes down to the fact that that socialism might have been possible if one had the right leadership with the right acts of will. But that seems to me to be contradicted by a number of things that Roger correctly said. He talked about Russia as being, the Soviet Union being a besieged fortress. He talked about war communism having a serious democratic deficit. But world socialism is not going to grow out of a besieged fortress. World socialism is not going to grow from a society in which democracy for the working class is not at its very heart. And of course, world communism is precisely not that. Well, I think, just my last point, one aspect of the German Revolution that hasn't been mentioned, of course, is the fact that the German state, unlike the Russian state, the German state had not collapsed. The German army was withdrawn from the First War in good order. Certain military divisions were, of course, thought to be not reliable. So the Freikorps was organized to deal with the revolutionary uprising in 1918, 1919. But the Freikorps did that these disorganized rebels quickly put down the attempts to set up Soviets or workers' governments in various cities. And these Soviets, such as in Munich and other places, were quickly isolated and defeated. There was no prospect whatsoever that there was going to be a German revolution. And if that is if the German Revolution is the justification for the Russian Revolution, then the whole thing started on a false premise. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Richard. Do you want to reply to any of that, Roger?
Well, there's so many points. I mean, I just think, you know, of course, mistakes were made, and I even gave a list of some of them. And I mean, they were, some of them have been referred to, you know, Trotsky on the trade union question, Lenin on the war in Poland, and of course, many more. But the question is, we have to put into context of a situation where the whole, when you say, I think you said, or you implied, that there was really no principled or qualitative difference between the policies of Lenin and Trotsky and those of Stalinism later. I mean, the point is that the one clear and absolutely fundamental difference was that Lenin and Trotsky were not trying to create a Russian state in isolation. Everything they did was subordinated to the need for the revolution to be international, to spread beyond the borders of Russia. And as I even said, I made the quote that Lenin even said, if necessary, we'd abandon the revolution in Russia. that means we would accept, the firing squad. We would accept the counter-revolution and falling victim to it, if by doing so we could help to guarantee the victory of the revolution in Germany and more advanced countries. Because all of these distortions and concessions and horrible disfigurements that you describe, including, of course, the awful events in Kronstadt, although I don't agree quite with your characterization of what happened, and including all the other harsh measures, for instance, the banning of factions in 1921. But I mean, that was they were forced on Lenin and Trotsky, and nobody could reasonably assume or imply that these were just pretexts that they made because they wanted to create a police state, a dictatorship in which they could rule Russia. Everything they did was to just hang on, to survive. It was a holding operation to keep the Russian Revolution alive just for long enough for the revolution to find a more fertile ground on which to flourish in Germany and in Western Europe. And so I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We've got quite a few comrades now, so I suggest I'll take 3 in a row, give you a little rest as well, Roger, and then you can reply, and then we have some more. Marion, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Very loudly, yes. Hi. Oh, now you've gone quiet. I think you muted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you again.
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasise the role of the war of intervention into Russia and the impact that that had. I think you can't underestimate that. But equally, nobody said much about the left opposition that Trotsky and others set up to try and fight within Russia to change the course and to stop the bureaucratization of the revolutionary situation. And let's not forget, most of the leaders of the Russian Revolution was murdered. Let's not forget that the failure, obviously, the not expanding the world revolution was bound to have a big impact. But what we must also remember, that a planned economy was set up, and we can't underestimate the importance of that. And I think if the world revolution has expanded, if Stalinism hadn't been triumphant, Spain might have turned out differently. Other situations might have been different. Now we can't really go on what ifs, but don't underestimate the role of people fighting within Russia, but equally the left opposition. James P. Cannon got hold of the left opposition documents and took it back to America and started a debate within America about what was going on in Russia and what positions people should take. So let's not underestimate that. And I'd like Roger to say a bit more about the left opposition. But equally, if you go beyond the remit of what this talks about, after the end of the Second World War, the revolution in Europe could have been expanded, could have succeeded if it wasn't for the Marshall Plan and the betrayal of Stalin wanting socialism in one country. But I'd like a bit more said about the role of the left opposition.
Thank you, Marion. Who's next? Joanne. Oh, no, sorry, I've highlighted wrong. Okay, Matthew, you go ahead, sorry.
Okay, thanks, comrades. It's been a very useful discussion, I think, so far. And thanks to Roger for taking on, which is a monster subject. And I said to him before, you could go on for a week. and not cover it all, really, I mean, solidly. But I think there's a few things that we should draw out, though, in these terms. I mean, I think, first of all, to say that, I mean, the Bolshevik Party was not a mass organization itself. And the problem, one of the problems it did have, of course, is it you know, the old guard, the actual Bolshevik Party, which went into 1917, which was tens of thousands of people, wind up running a huge country. So in fact, I mean, while people may have started off as shop stewards and whatever else, they actually wound up running, said those people wound up running groups of factories and entire industries and all the rest of it. So they had anybody who was capable of anything was probably summoned into line, or else had to go off and run bits of the army. Again, I mean, an organization. The other thing about it, of course, the Bolshevik Party was an organization which was underground, permanently underground. I mean, the average active life on the ground of a Bolshevik cadre or any left cadre in Russia was 6 months before they were arrested. It was a totally different form of organization than in Western Europe, and they understood that. But the problem was, of course, they tended to try, the fact that the domination of the Russian methods, actually went across the whole Comintern. I think, and if you look at things like what they did in terms of sort of building, something that's never been done in history before or since, which is to build an entire army under fire on the basis of one intact division, and then win. Which is, I mean, just incredible. Nobody's ever likely to do that again. The other thing, I think, the other important thing about the Bolshevik Party, I think, which is critical to the whole business, is the fact they'd actually been through a revolution before. They'd been through 1905. They'd been over the course and lost, and had come out without too much damage in terms of the killing of cadre and so on and so forth. The people were still there, so they'd actually been over the course beforehand, which nobody else had. That was incredibly important. So they understood the mechanisms and so on and so forth, which is not something that was shared anywhere else in Europe. And I think that's really vital in those terms. I think in terms of, I mean, if you look at Germany, I mean, Germany was a mess. I mean, the problem was it was, the way it operated. I mean, in terms of the fact that Luxembourg and Liebenknecht were offered the chance to go into the USPD and have a dominant role or a leading role in the USPD, and they turned it down. And we have to, that was a mistake. Not to isolate yourself from that, even if you're a minority, under the conditions. That's a mistake. The other mistake, of course, they committed was actually allowing themselves to be killed. They didn't actually understand the importance of having themselves kept alive. The fact that Luxembourg was wandering around the streets of Berlin, which were infested with troops trying to kill her. I mean, that's just the height of stupidity. That also, of course, is also put, that actually it was possible that the workers of Berlin could have stopped the Freikorps from getting in the city. All they had to do was stop railway. And they didn't do it, and there wasn't actually a command chain of command to say, right, okay, we'll get these guys stopped, and prevent them from getting into the city. They could have done it. So there's that. I think there's also the other thing. I think the other thing that's important actually is this approach, and I think I agree with Luxembourg's critique actually of the 21 conditions, because it's a method of attempting to use like this sort of command thing in order to try and get around a bureaucratic method of actually getting through important political problems, rather than actually having a political debate and working it through in terms of the class and so on, trying to impose this sort of bureaucratic blockage, which of course ain't going to work. I mean, clearly didn't work and was wrong. And two, you're also looking at a situation where the Comintern won the majority of the PSI, and then of course split off with the minority. It's ridiculous. I mean, just as a methodology, it's crazy. Again, Roger says, you know, the Norwegian Labour Party decides to affiliate to the Comintern, and then, of course, is then taken out by the 29 conditions. I mean, you know, as a method, it's wrong. And I think you have to be critical in those terms. But we also have to say, you know, to try and understand the material, the importance of the material condition, and how, you know, what lessons can you actually take, you know, into the current position. And I think it's also to say, well, the problem is, of course, that what comes down is, you know, a notion that what's written is always right. You know, that either Lenin or Trotsky or Stalin or whoever else is always, you know, you've always got to follow that stuff. Actually, rather than the approach, to take a critical approach to it, and then to go back as comrades have been doing and looking at the actual documents and saying, okay, well, you know, this is what actually happened, rather than say, well, we interpret the whole world through a series of writings, however good those are. And I think there's been a great deal of research which has been done, which is very, very good and useful. And really, we ought to be looking at saying, okay, well, you know, how do we actually sort of look at, you know, the drawing together of a revolutionary international, and why, and what were the factors that caused the German Revolution to fail? You know, which is obviously the important point. And I think that is, you know, it's not merely on the failures is not merely on the side of the Comintern. Although, I mean, the attitude of the likes of Zinoviev was appalling. There was also a series of failures within the KPD itself, and the forces coming into the KPD. The fact the guy, that Levy, who actually was, you know, Luxembourg's executor and probably the guy who had the greatest, deepest understanding, was actually expelled from the Comintern itself. It's a ludicrous thing. You know, such a comrade should be expelled, you know, under those conditions. So I think, you know, as I say, it's a critical approach, but it's actually then to understand, you know, all the bits of the puzzle. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Joanne, and then I'll bring in Roger again.
Right, I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, brilliant. I've had problems connecting me headphones at this end.
Oh, it's all good.
So I've been struggling to hear, but what I wanted to say, I've come across this narrative that Lenin was Stalin was the continuation of Leninism, and of course Kronstadt was a terrible crime against the you know, on the part of the Bolsheviks, and from a comrade that I've had a lot to do with over the years, you know, he would have argued that since he read the stuff that was declassified after the counter-revolution in Russia, the archives open, that he would go along with this sort of thing. But I've examined that in detail. It's not something that you can really tackle in a video conference like this, because you have to have facts at your fingertips. It's best done in the written form. But having said that, having read looked into it in greater depth, reading Lenin and Trotsky on the subjects, I have to say that I've rejected that notion. One important factor that I think maybe hasn't been mentioned is the assassination attempt on Lenin in 1919, which left a bullet in his neck. By 1923, he was severely impacted by that, and I think that they eventually tried to remove the bullet, and he died shortly after that. But Lenin, you have to remember, was going against the majority at one point with his April thesis, because I think Lenin, above anybody else in the Bolshevik movement, was head and shoulders above them in terms of his natural ability to employ dialectical logic, and therefore he was a brilliant strategist. But there was another hiatus when it came to the settlement with Germany before the end of the First World War, and the Brest-Litovsk treaty was initially very unpopular, and it was Lenin that is very forceful argument that persuaded the Brest-Litovsk treaty to go ahead, and none of the people involved would have had any idea whatsoever that America was going to a few months along the line was going to enter the war, and that the Germans would be defeated. And following the German defeat, of course, with armies mobilized around Europe, this was the start of the wars of intervention that Roger has mentioned. Nobody could have seen this coming at the time, that it would occur so rapidly and in such a way. So I think Lenin, incapacitated by the various strokes he had after the around in the early 20s, was really not in a position to kind of provide the kind of leadership that it provided in the past. And Stalin was certainly cunning enough to maneuver himself into a position where he became the ultimate leader. He was no dialectician. He was I mean, Trotsky understood his dialectics. I think it was Tagliotelli or something, an Italian that tutored him in dialectics. But Lenin, above anybody else, was a dialectician of excellence, more so than Plekhanov. So, those things contribute to what followed afterwards.
Thanks, Joanne. Roger, do you want to reply to a few things?
Well, there's so many points. I think really we could do with another meeting on this.
Yeah.
Really, a lot of the discussion was really on Russia, on the situation in Russia, and not very much on the International, which was what I was concentrating on. But I do think it's quite right that it's impossible to understand the developments and the collapse of the International without understanding the growth of the Stalinist bureaucracy and the hideous deformation of the workers' state. I do think that in the early years, in the conditions of extreme hardship, unbelievable hardship, in the conditions where most of the conscious strata of the working class were wiped out in the Civil War, in conditions where as I say, conditions of almost of barbarism in the country at the end of the First World War, and with the overrunning by all the armies of the world, if you like, all trying to crush the new workers' state in the cradle. In that situation, the key question was to hold on, to keep the Russian Revolution alive just long enough for the revolution to succeed and to take root on more fertile ground, and especially in Germany. And I really do think perhaps a separate session on what happened in Germany would be crucial to an understanding of all this. But the difference between Lenin and Trotsky on the one hand, and Stalin and all his acolytes on the other, was this question of socialism in one country. That's what it came to, because what was meant by socialism in one country was, as I think Stalin put it at one time in his usual crude language, he said, keep we don't want an inch of your territory, said to the world capitalists, but keep your swinish snouts out of our beautiful Soviet garden. Now, that was the complete and diametric antithesis and opposite of the policy of Lenin and Trotsky, which was we'd be prepared to sacrifice the Russian Revolution in the interests of if it would aid the cause of the revolution in the more advanced developed country in the West. I think I'd really like to leave it there, but perhaps we can come back to it in a later discussion. Yes,
we probably should, but though we might have to delay it a bit because we've got some other sessions planned now. But it's clearly we're talking about world revolutionary, world history events that do need a few sessions to discuss. Murray, I think your camera might not work, so I've unmuted you if you want to come in. Murray? Oh, your camera does work. There you are.
The wealth of detail that people have got at their fingertips is just astounding.
You're very quiet, comrade. Could you go closer to your microphone by any chance?
I keep coming back in my mind to this issue of how do you start a new mode of production, and particularly when the opposition to you having a new mode of production is so strategic and so intelligent and so ruthless. So from that it just seemed that the preconditions in which you start setting priorities if you're trying to head up a workers' movement just don't. I'm not saying anything you don't already understand. Thanks ever so much for the presentation you've given. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. Okay, Steve, please.
Sorry, Tina and Roger. Thank you, Roger, for your presentation. Very good presentation. However, what I want to do is just go back. I think, as it's why Marx. Let's go back to Marx for a minute, since he didn't get much of a mention in any of this story. And of course, what we were talking about when we were talking about Marx was we were talking about the centrality of democracy in Marx's politics, and the importance of a democratic republic, to establish a democratic republic. That is to say, and he had the model, as it were, of the Paris Commune, or learnt from the Paris Commune what was meant by a democratic republic. And that was a very, very central idea. And it was an idea opposed by the left reformists on one hand, and by the anarchists and anarcho-communists on another. Now, if we take that into account, we can think of the Russian Revolution as the birth and death of democracy. And we can ask ourselves, how was democracy born in Russia? And how did it die, and when did it die? And in that sense, we would be taking our understanding from Marx. So, okay, obviously, it was born in February 1917, when Russia became a republic. And then, of course, in October, the struggle of the working class established a new type of republic, a version, something more like the Paris Commune. And Lenin was talking about this in State and Revolution, of course. So they established a really democratic state, and it was between October 1917 and probably about March 1918, sometimes called the golden period of Russian democracy, Soviet democracy as well. And then the counter-revolution came in, of course, to destroy all of that democracy, the democracy of the working class and the support of the peasantry. And the counter-revolution just about destroyed all that. But because the Bolsheviks and the Red Army was victorious, that by November 1920, having won the Civil War, defeated the attempt to overthrow their democracy in November 1920, the working class, having won the Civil War, wanted their democracy back. They were not happy with the regime that they'd ended up as a result of war communism. and they began carrying out strikes and other action to get better pay, better conditions. We're talking about the beginning of 1921. And of course, that's the context where you come to Kronstadt. Kronstadt can be seen as an attempt to restore a kind of Paris Commune type state to get back. Because it wasn't, it was an accident almost, was Kronstadt. They wanted to re-elect the Soviets and re-elect their deputies and make them accountable and have meetings. And of course, we know what happened, unfortunately. Democracy died in Russia at that point with the defeat of the Kronstadters. And Lenin realized later on it was a mistake. I do think he did think that. Trotsky always was trying to justify it. But at that point, the bureaucracy that you talked about started to gain control of the party, etc. So the rise of Stalinism comes from the defeat of the working class and the loss of any kind of democracy in Russia. Now, we should be talking about these democratic republics elsewhere. You know, the Irish Republic, 1916, the February one I mentioned, the October Hungarian Republic, 1918, the November Republic in Germany, the Austrian Republic. Only one of those did the working class take those republics and turn them into genuinely democratic ones, and that was the Russian example. And what was unique about that was, I think, and this was the skill of Lenin, was that Lenin very strongly understood he had to win the majority of the working class and the majority of the peasantry to support that republic. He waited until the time was ripe in October for the working class to take power. So I will finish on this point, Tina, before we. This was a key thing that possibly didn't take place in the German Revolution. That they never took the time it would take time to win the majority of the working class who disunited, disorganized working class to see the need for a genuinely democratic republic. And that never happened in Germany. And in that sense, Rosa Luxemburg, Tina mentioned this before, Rosa Luxemburg, I think it was Tina mentioned this, Rosa Luxemburg, who was more cautious than Leibniz, who wanted to go ahead and try to have an uprising when you really didn't have yet won the argument with the working class, and that ended in a kind of a disaster. So Lenin, by keeping his link to the working class and winning the majority of the working class, was able to be more successful in the fight for democracy than, unfortunately, the Germans were. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Steve. Last person from the floor is Victor, and then we'll get Roger briefly in, and we'll finish by 9.
Good evening, comrades. I've often heard Stalin being accused of only wanting socialism or only wanting communism in one country. That's often repeated, and it's repeated so many times, it's almost become true. But isn't it a fact that before Stalin finished his leadership, when he popped his clogs, he'd expanded communism from the west of Berlin to the east of Beijing? That doesn't quite square with someone who only wants it in one country, does it? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Victor. Okay. Great discussion generally, everybody. Thank you so much for participating. And Roger's going to sum up now in a second, but I think we do have to understand that it was supposed to be a session about the Third International, just the Comintern, and Roger's been fielding questions on all sorts of issues to do with the Soviet Union, Russia, etc., which is sort of understandable because it's, you know, that period. But yeah, we'll try to bring it back a little bit there. So, Roger, when you're summing up as well, perhaps you could sort of sum up with an idea of the key lesson, perhaps, for communists today, for socialists today, from that period. I mean, socialism in one country is a hugely important one. I think Anne was right to point that one out. That should be a huge danger sign to us that this is not something we should try to copy ever.
Well, once again, it's been a really stimulating discussion and a really kaleidoscopic range of ideas and points to come in. I hope you'll understand that I can't attempt to reply to more than one or two. But what I was trying to do in my lead off was not to talk about abstractions about democracy and we have to I'm trying to put it in the actual material conditions of the time, the pressures of the time, and particularly to put it in the context of the world situation. And I can only say again, Russia, if you were picking a country to have a socialist revolution on its own, Russia was the last one you would pick, for reasons which I think should have become clear, from what I said before. And therefore, all these talks, it wasn't really democratic. I mean, put it in a context with actually of civil war and barbarism and complete and starvation and foreign occupation and all the rest of it. In that situation, they had to improvise. They had to live from hand to mouth, and they switched policy. So everybody talks about, quite rightly, about how the strains became intolerable at the end of war communism. War communism was imposed on them by the fact that they had a war, with a world war, if you like, where all the armies of capitalism in the world were there trying to smash and crush the revolution in Russia. And the fact that they didn't succeed in that is itself just almost unbelievable achievement of the Russian working class. And in that situation, we have to put it into the context, as I say. The working class of Russia held on for as long as they could at the cost of just inconceivable sacrifices. Even the generation that carried through the revolution were either they lost their lives in the civil war itself, because they were the cream of the working class, the cream of the proletariat, and of course the entire Communist Party was annihilated, massacred by Stalin and the bureaucracy in the period after that. And I think I did emphasize that. So we have to understand it in the context that the Russian Revolution can only be understood as one key sector of the world situation that was developing, and all the distortions and all the concessions and all the horrors, if you like, that developed there. We have to see that they are an outcome of that extraordinary situation. I think we need to have another discussion, perhaps one on Germany, definitely, but perhaps I think we did it a couple of years ago, but a discussion on Russia again and what happened and how the revolution became sterilized and bureaucratized. Because I think the key thing is in this discussion is to see, as you said, as you kind of suggested, that I should end up with the question of a revolutionary international. How will an international be built? And I think today, looking around the world, obviously we can't talk about world perspectives today in the last couple of minutes of this meeting, but we do have a situation more fertile and more rich in revolutionary possibilities than we could ever see in history before now. We see now on every continent, every day, we see outbursts and uprisings and manifestations of the absolutely impossible crisis of capitalism that exists in country after country and continent after continent. And in that situation, the one absolutely elementary thing is that we need to have some way of linking up together an international, not of course an international. Comrade talked about the 21 conditions. I think that was forced on them in a particular situation there. We're not talking about an international where we would lay down the precepts and make 21 or 210 conditions that are, I mean, that is not the point. The point now is simply to have a means of bringing together and learning from one another's experiences. That should be an international where every conceivable manifestation of revolt against capitalist society should be there. That we wouldn't have wouldn't start with a particular line. It would, in many ways, it would be more akin to the first international than to the third. But a means, a workshop, a network, a means by which the working class of all these the head of all these struggles could compare experiences, learn from one another, discuss conclusions, and begin to coordinate their activities into a united movement to change society. So thanks, comrades. I've enjoyed very much these 3 sessions, and I learned a lot from the discussion and from the contributions that comrades have made. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I think just in the spirit of what you describe, a democratic international where you have differences of opinion, etc. In that spirit are also our sessions, of course. And this was what tonight was all about. I think we've seen contributions from comrades who come from very different political backgrounds and traditions. And it's really good to discuss with each other and to hear where comrades are coming from. 2 hours is not going to solve our differences or get us to a joint understanding of something, but we can discuss and we can raise differences and in a democratic way, and that is very worthwhile itself. Next week we are going to look back at the Second International again, because we did discuss last week to invite Mike Tabor, who's done a lot of work on the Second International, discussing, drawing out the differences between the revolutionaries and the social pacifists, or reformists, I think he calls them. And he's just presenting those arguments, and we touched upon them last week, and we'll get back to that in the week after. And then we are starting a new subsection called the transition to socialism, from capitalism to socialism, and what role, for example, religion plays within Marx, law, ideology, class consciousness, etc., and how we get to the transition to socialism in those areas. These will we'll put together a program very, very soon and put it out to comrades, and you hope you'll all participate. Already almost had about 100 members again in the meeting tonight, attendees, which is great, and it shows there's a real interest and real desire to talk about these issues. So thank you very much, comrades, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.